So the format for kind of today's session, and Josh, thanks again to Monterey DART for kind of hosting this event. This has grown over the years. It's been exciting to see. I think the last time I was here in person was before the pandemic, and it should continue to improve and grow in terms of content and the audience. So today here we've had kind of a conversation about kind of the rules of kind of engagement for today's session. So we got kind of two folks that are remote. What I'm going to do is start out by kind of doing a brief introduction of kind of all of our panelists, and we'll start with Yolanka in a moment. We'll conclude with Yotam at the end. We'll do kind of the virtual panels, George and Adrienne in between. And then we'll go into a moderated discussion. So with us today, we've got a really great distinguished panel. We have, to my left, Yolanka Wulff, who's Executive Director of the Community Air Mobility Initiative. Online joining us, we have George Kivork, Head of State and Local Policy for Joby Aviation. We also have online with us Adrienne Lindgren, Head of City Activation at Supernal. And on my far left, here in person, we have Yotam Avrahmi, Commercial and Public-Private Partnership for Intelligent Transportation Lead over at Deloitte. So I'd like to invite each of the panels. We'll start with Yolanka first to kind of do a brief introduction about kind of her role at her organization. And we'll continue on, and then when we conclude, we'll go into our discussion today.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And I think I did have one slide. Am I going to blot out Adrienne and George here? And if sorry, you two. So thanks, Adam, again. And it's great to be here. This is my first time attending this symposium. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to tell you about CAMI, the Community Air Mobility Initiative. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to support the sustainable and responsible integration of advanced air mobility into daily transportation needs through education, communication, and collaboration. Specifically, we work with state and local and regional decision makers, agencies, airports, transportation planners to educate those stakeholders about advanced air mobility and to work with them on the integration of advanced air mobility as a mode in their multimodal transportation systems where it makes sense. So I want to just tell you about a couple of programs. Our signature program is our Urban Air Policy Collaborative. You can see on the map, this is we have run so far 4 cohorts with almost 30 jurisdictions. This is a 9-week curriculum. We meet for 2 hours every week. And it's for public agency staff and airport staff. I'm pleased to say Monterey DART has been through it, Marina Airport has been through it, Monterey County, City of San Jose, Caltrans, CalSTA, as well as you can see, a number of other jurisdictions across the country. So we cover everything from the aviation fundamentals of advanced air mobility to multimodal integration, equity challenges, community environmental issues, planning, noise, et cetera. Our 5th cohort will start in January, so we've had almost 100 staff across the country participate so far. We are also, we have a number of resources on our website that you can look at. We run our AAM 101 half-day short course. Our most recent one was done in August at SFO in conjunction with Berkeley's Future of Aviation Conference. Adam works closely with CAMI. He's one of our expert contributors and board members. We recently completed a emerging practices playbook for NASA, which is in final stages of layout for publication. We're currently writing about a 60-page planning guidebook for the American Planning Association, and we're doing an ACRP project putting together a primer and toolkit for airports on community integration and engagement. So I'll talk more substantively as we have our conversation, but that's who we are, that's who CAMI is, and I'm pleased to be here.
Terrific, thank you. So we're going to go next to George online.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very creative presentation format. Really, really appreciate the flexibility and accommodating our in-firm here, me and Adrienne, during this presentation. So thank you for that. I will just take maybe a couple minutes, and if I can quickly do a walk through a short slideshow, sort of give you an overview of who's Joby, who am I, what have we done, what are we doing, and where we're going to go as quickly as possible. So as Adam mentioned, George Kivork and I oversee the state and local policy, come from a previous life of city life and rideshare world as well. But don't hold those against me. I'm also a recovering lawyer, so a lot of negative whammies here. But the benefit of being at Joby is that we're doing this on the front end. And I think to Josh's point earlier, when it comes to infrastructure and community, I think most of the technology communities realized getting in early and getting it on the ground and engaging folks is going to pay its own dividends in bringing this revolutionary technology forward. So who is Joby? Joby is a vertically integrated transportation company. That's a mouthful to say. We've essentially designed, are building, and we'll be manufacturing these aircraft that we have created, and we'll be operating a service that will bring aerial rideshare to a city near you, integrated with the community and the neighborhood within their policy transportation framework. We went public this past summer. We have been in operations for over 10 years. Doing a lot of flight testing up in Santa Cruz, California, as well as Marina, California, where we have our full-scale aircraft doing testing. And we are sprinkled across Northern California. As I mentioned, most of our headquarters is in Santa Cruz, but a lot of our actual manufacturing powertrain production is in San Carlos/SFO area. And Marina is where, like I mentioned, we do all of our daily flight testing. So you can walk down and probably see the aircraft daily doing its turns and tests at the Marina Municipal Airport. Just stay on the other side of the fence. So that is kind of who Joby is. What have we built? We built an aircraft that has an electric aircraft that has a capacity to take off vertically like a helicopter and transition on the wings in flight and fly like a traditional aircraft. And therefore, we'll be able to get certified through the FAA within some existing frameworks, as well as some of you have seen recently, I'm sure, some of the Federal Register rules for how this would be operated as a powered lift. The aircraft has 0 operating emissions. It is operated on 4 batteries, 6 propellers, and it goes up to 200 miles an hour and has a 150-mile range plus a reserve. And it is a piloted aircraft. We feel that that's kind of the initial entry into the system, really helps have that pilot engagement for the FAA process. We have partnered with several folks on sort of going to market, manufacturing and infrastructure. As I mentioned, the Air Force and NASA have been key allies in helping us understand the unlock for this opportunity in the community. Toyota has been a huge advocate for us in streamlining and helping us with scaling up for our manufacturing, where we'll be building several of these, dozen next year and probably 50 or more within the coming years per year. So that is the aircraft that we have built. What are we bringing? For those who have had to struggle with LA and deal with traffic, for example, one example would be a node where you would go from downtown LA to LAX in 8 minutes with apparently drive time of 23 minutes. So that is kind of what we hope to bring to you as a service. What's the unlock and how will we do this? We think noise is the critical element, which is why we spent several years with NASA refining, improving our case point on what our volume is going to be and our impact, coming in at 45 decibels when we're in flight, which means it's practically inaudible, and around 65 decibels conversation speed at takeoff. And that's, again, illustrated there where NASA came in and set a special array of 50 microphones across our field to do the analysis. For us, this is the unlock and the acceptance in the community, because if you look at the noise profile of how this compares to helicopter or traditional transportation nodes that folks are accustomed to, it really juxtaposes what is the potential here and the opportunity to bring the traditional nuisance of aviation, whether it's fuels, emissions, as well as noise, and eliminate those to unlock the infrastructure and the community acceptance that we really need. And in terms of infrastructure, this is kind of an illustration I just like to point out that we don't plan to build new things because of the light capacity of the aircraft, because of the light capacity of the operations. We'll be able to use existing airports as obviously ground starting point, but the goal is to bring these and be able to park them on top of existing rooftop decks, on top of existing heliports, because there's no need for a recreation of brand new infrastructure other than probably slight modifications and edifications that we hope to do with other OEMs and cities to bring to you. And that's it, the presentation, I think. Oh.
Thank you, George. So now we'll go over to Adrienne and then conclude with Yotam. Adrienne.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me today and making this virtual format work. Sorry, my lighting doesn't seem to be on my side today based on where the sun is, but I'm sorry I couldn't in person. Like George, have been under the weather, but appreciate this dynamic format. Let me go ahead and share my presentation and give you a little bit of background and context about myself. I lead our city activations team. Broadly speaking, that means we work on all the things off aircraft required to make the urban air mobility ecosystem come to life. We are part of Hyundai Motor Group, so we are under the brand name Supernal, but we are part of a large group of companies that you can see some of them here, about 53 affiliates. And, we have basically built this sort of industrial conglomerate over about the last, I'd say about 80 years. We actually started in transportation infrastructure, vehicle reliability and affordability really became our sweet spot going into the 60s. And then really since 2010s, we have been very focused on advanced ground and air mobility, investing in multiple forms of sort of advanced technologies, and really thinking about how we can leverage those different investments to apply them to a broad suite of transportation verticals. And Supernal is really Hyundai's commitment to the advanced air mobility space. So we are very focused, especially under the direction of our new chairman, on building human-centered cities that leverage technology advancements to really focus on delivering universal and affordable mobility and a seamless customer journey. My background, like George, I was in the public sector, worked for local government here in Los Angeles, then ended up on the engineering services side. I've been in a few different areas and sat at different parts of the table. So for me, it was a really interesting opportunity to come to Supernal and influence product development so that we're really making products that people want and that they're going to find utility out of, especially knowing that not so many people are comfortable in small aircraft. And that's part of our task at hand, right, is sort of socializing them. And I'll get into that. Just wanted to quickly, preview. We are looking at a lot of different technologies and investing in a lot of different pieces of this space, but a lot of it converges around, again, these sort of core sets of technology advancements and enabling technologies that we believe are fundamental to both aviation, but are becoming sort of shared across a lot of different transportation verticals. We realize that vehicles are only kind of one component of the AAM sort of revolution. There's a lot of moving parts. We're obviously in the vehicle and subsystems aftermarket, also heavily engaged with workforce development institutions, and then working with partners to really build out that physical infrastructure, including folks like George at Joby and some of the other people I'm sure in the audience. We're really looking at leveraging those strategic partnerships so that, yes, Hyundai's there, and Supernal sort of, at the epicenter of the aircraft. But we believe there's a whole host of commercial partners, local partners, and national partners that are really critical in enabling this ecosystem. And a lot of my focus is on how do we think about AAM as a value add to current mobility. So how do we think about the right sort of data sources, pieces of analysis? How do we, to sort of George's earlier point, how do we think about existing infrastructure, and what can we do to enhance that infrastructure, provide things like increased grid resiliency, provide a dynamic mode of driving people into existing transportation networks, with a focus sort of on reducing that amount of personal owned vehicle traffic and moving towards more efficiency. I'll just say from sort of the process of what I do, again, a lot of my work is focused on those off-aircraft systems, thinking about that infrastructure and how we get to socializing with communities, cultivating that consumer interest in something that's really a new field for many, many people, working with local enablement partners, thinking about policy and permitting, and then really focusing on modeling demand, impacts, and supporting permitting so that we can get to our service launch, which we're targeted more towards 2028. And really then moving into a process of continuous improvement based on the feedback that we're getting from our customers. I don't think this video is working, so I'll go ahead and move past it. But we were, some of the different ways I just want to showcase that we work with communities. We were part of the UKRI Future Flight Challenge that took place earlier this year, where we did basically a full-scale demonstration of the infrastructure and of the, of course, it always starts working at the wrong time, but I'll move on. So we were part of the UK Future Flight Challenge. Again, a lot of that was socialization. We worked with Network Rail, the UK national government, Coventry City Council, where it actually took place outside of London. And we're, again, trying to really invest in living laboratory concepts, similar to a lot of the folks in the industry. How do we create bi-directional feedback loops so that we're getting product input as we continue to invest in our product? And then finally, I'll just close on a couple of slides that I'll bring up. I think one of the big challenges of AAM is putting people in the position of seeing how it relates to them. So we've worked with a lot of different local organizations to think about what could AAM look like as a piece of community activation and placemaking? How does it interact with other pieces of mobility infrastructure? And how can it be right-sized in different ways, whether you're building new infrastructure or you're building on existing infrastructure? These are smaller footprint type of pieces of infrastructure for lower demand, right? But you can also think about it as these sort of larger mobility hubs where you're wrapping around and integrating autonomous vehicles, you're looking at pedestrian mobility, looking at electric vehicle charging for different buses. So again, a lot of the work that I'm doing is very focused on how do we effectively engage with communities and the relevant stakeholders, a lot of the folks in this room, to bring AAM to life in a way that's really meaningful for people and with products that people really want to utilize.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks, Adrienne. Yotam.
Yeah, it's working, yeah. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Josh, for the great event in DART. Really happy to be here. Yotam Avrahmi, I'm the only one without PowerPoint, so I'm just going to introduce myself and a little bit about the unit that we're working with, specifically around intelligent transportation. So Yotam Avrahmi, I'm leading the commercial side of the intelligent transportation practice in Deloitte, US, based in New York City. We are trying to focus on moving to the next generation of transportation efficiency, accessibility, and cost effectiveness into implementing multimodal transportation solutions. So we are focusing not only on the air side, as the AAM and the UAS side that we really invested in the last couple of years. We also trying to encourage and incorporate ground transportation, multimodal transportation that goes from mass transit to V2X, and all the layer that we see it as a one kind of a tool to increase the ability to move efficiently and mainly to tackle the obstacles we see from a policy perspective and the commercial side towards traffic and other elements that we're trying to focus on from the Deloitte side of the ecosystem. We're working across multiple layers in the US, from corporate side that I'm focusing on from the PPP, the engagement perspective that connects the commercial efforts to go to a ROI-oriented kind of approach towards the public need and interest, community engagement, and research development with R&D centers and test sites. We're working, as I mentioned, corporate test and DOTs. We're working with most DOTs in the US currently, and an economic development group that focus on the subject matter. So we're creating some kind of a benchmark of knowledge to understand how the major trend in the US will translate into, hopefully, the next 10 years to see some change from the perspective of the complete trip, the last mile perspective, and most importantly, in some of our last projects was around logistics. We see that the changes and the efforts from a capital perspective goes a lot to moving goods and to moving passengers from our efforts. So we see it as a one kind of tool to improve the ecosystem. Currently, we're trying to move most of our effort in the AAM side from the wow projects to the how projects. We really see a lot of wow projects in the last 3 years, a lot of wow effects and efforts from most agencies in the US that focus on getting education, exploration to most of decision-making processes and investment, to make sure that people are engaged, to make sure that people know what to do with the solution that we mentioned here. If we're thinking about the UAS side and the massive UTM implementation that we're trying to do in New York and New Jersey, in other areas. And if you look at the AAM concept of operations that we work with NASA to develop, and the roadmap that we created with New Jersey around the next couple of years, how can a state will look at the AAM from a practical perspective, not only, okay, this is a new toy, a new amazing solution vehicle that could be the next generation of as Dean said before, and I think Dean and Raja took all my ideas in the beginning of those discussion, amazing points, but the point we're trying to make is AAM is one solution in a multimodal transportation solution that needs to be relevant to specific use cases and to need to be incorporated in a much bigger capital planning, multi-year element that will hopefully be helpful for the most efficient areas. For example, we did some research around a density of a couple of cities that equal to warehouse efficiency from cost perspective. So the point I'm trying to make here is how can we move from the discussion of high-level investment in test sites, in concept of operations, in the high-level discussions to actual planning layers, from metropolitan planning operations and authorities to port authorities, working with 4 port authorities currently to try to think about their next capital cycles, how they trying to plan eVTOL infrastructure incorporate into their 10-year engagement perspective. So if you think about what we are trying to do and to be, is to make sure that all the great effort that we see here from George and Adrienne and everyone that talked before me, incorporating into actual operational layer with the relevant corporate and public agencies. I think that's enough. What do you think?
Sure.
Yeah, great.
So these are some really great introductions here. You know, this is a topic that I think is so very important because, and I might be a little bit biased here, but you know, I'm of the opinion that, you know, we can engineer our way out of many different challenges, but at the end of the day, if we don't have infrastructure, takeoff and land, and if we don't have community support, advanced air mobility is not going to fly, both literally and figuratively. So one of the questions that I have kind of for the panel is really, what types of policies do you think are needed to kind of make sure that advanced air mobility is integrated into a multimodal system?
I'll jump in. So we could talk a long time about this question, and I know it's not your only question. But I think, certainly from the work that we've done through our Urban Air Policy Collaborative, we have heard from a number of public agencies, including state and local DOTs, port authorities, airports, planners, et cetera. And I also want to just mention the survey that Berkeley did last year, which reached over 100, I believe, DOTs, MPOs, et cetera. And we heard this also from Raja earlier. The principal concerns that we hear from these different public agencies are that their biggest concerns are equity, noise, and safety. Most public agencies that we work with are mandated to look at all new projects through an equity lens. So I would say that in terms of policy, we need to understand that as we start to do the things that Yotam has mentioned, including bringing this down to a real planning cycle level in terms of transportation planning, airport planning, infrastructure planning, as well as funding, we have to ensure that we are creating a system in which this new mode integrates with other modes to make that complete trip. And I'm glad Raja talked about Marchetti's constant and induced demand, because it saves me from having to explain that. But that is a real concern. We have to be realistic about both the positives and negatives that this mode introduces. And for the first time, aviation is being asked to act as a mode in a multimodal system. Aviation as a form of transportation has existed separately from other modes, in particular ground modes. And also we're integrating two communities that have not historically worked together. And that's the aviation community, including FAA and airports and all of the related agencies, as well as carriers and OEMs on the one side, and local planners and decision makers, mayors, city councils on the other. So I think that's a lot of the work that CAMI does, is to bridge that gap, bring those communities together to envision what this form of transportation looks like. And so I think the policies involved span the gamut from how we plan infrastructure to ensure that this is contributory to a multimodal integration or multimodal transportation system, to operations, real-time operations. How does a weather incident that grounds urban air taxi travel impact what happens to public transit, light rail on the ground, serving commuters on any given day? So there's a planning aspect and an operational aspect, and I think our policies have to build around that, as well as ensure that we are building an equitable system.
Thanks, Yolanka. I mean, that's a really great point. I'm so glad you mentioned, equity as well, because, it's a really important piece of the conversation. Yotam, you were going to add something.
Yeah, exactly on the topic. Thank you, Adam. Specifically because the main challenge now, as we move from the wow to how, as you mentioned now, Yolanka, around how to make it real, how to incorporate into capital planning, is the capital, is the problem of risk. As we seeing this emerging infrastructure and emerging transportation coming to life, who's going to take the blame, the risk in the first act to go with a skin in the game, not only small investment and actual investment that goes into how this will work in a major real-time life with other integration points. For example, how a port authority will include infrastructure for eVTOL transit into their current capital. Every mile, every centimeter in the port authority is currently allocated for a need, and being really, there is a lot of competition for that infrastructure and capital. And the way that we see that those emerging technology usually being implemented in past experience, how we see it in technologies from the, let's say, last generation of cellular infrastructure that been implemented in the past, and other transportation models like tolling systems that we see coming to life in a lot of areas from heavy, expensive infrastructure, is that sharing of cost between corporate and public entity to give some assurances that the public can come and say, the public agencies can come and say, we want this solution. We want this solution to work, and we guarantee some kind of investment from our side, and we want to see and we want to give a long-term perspective for ecosystem to centralize and to work together, because currently the market is decentralized strongly, to work together towards those PPP, kind of public-private partnership offerings, that the public side will set the stage for the need in a long-term solution perspective, and the corporate and the startups and the ecosystem will organize accordingly with enough time and capital to bring to the table a real solution that satisfies that need. Those structures currently not exist enough. There is some, but we are really trying to encourage our clients, and hopefully this room, to start thinking with the logic of how we reduce the risk by create some kind of assurance to centralize the market towards a real need.
So Adrienne and George, what are your thoughts from your perspectives in terms of policies that are needed to kind of encourage multimodal integration?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off and then pass it over to George. I'll keep it brief. I think there's a few core areas. So, I mean, we all know certification is one of them, and that's actively being worked on. Airspace design, right, for accommodating an increase in aircraft and also an increase in low altitude aircraft, I think is a major policy area. Then you get to the ground, land use planning, building in safety, fire codes, right? All of those sort of, you need someone at your plan check counter to be able to approve what you're putting up and understand the dynamics and make sure you have the appropriate responses in place. And then I think I'll just touch on one thing that has come up, I think, a couple of times around equity, and we've also, I think, talked about in this group how you're bringing a lot of different cultures together, government cultures, private sector, different layers of government jurisdictions. And we talk about equity a lot, but I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of different ways that these different agencies define equity. So the FAA's definition of equity and your city's definition of equity or city planning, right, are different. So I think there's a need to probably look at how do we approach policy that sometimes uses shared vernacular but does not necessarily imply the same thing. And so I think that speaks to just a broader need to harmonize policy, both communication and implementation across the multiple sort of complex jurisdictions and layers of authorities that will be at the table.
Thanks, Adrienne.
And just on the jurisdiction element, I think that all I would add is that I think the challenge here is it's less on the silver bullet for the policy, and I think Yolanka really nailed it, like the multiple groups that will have to go through their priorities, but I think it's also the entry points. This AAM doesn't fit neatly into any bucket within any policy or regulatory government. It's airports, it's transportation official, it's planning, it's might be housing. It really blends, and I think having political leadership is almost what you really need. And I hearken to sort of when we were doing sustainability 2 decades or a decade ago, when we were trying to figure out, well, where do you do sustainability in the city, or where do you do sustainability within a government? And it didn't fit into a resiliency, was a technology, and they just said, look, we need to create a new chief sustainability that'll transcend all of the departments within a government, within a city, or within a county to tackle this issue. I'm not saying we need to create new AAM officials, but I think identifying who is the appropriate lead within the political policy framework to have those conversations, I think is going to be a little more important maybe than the perfect policy just yet.
That's terrific. So, Yotam, you kind of mentioned kind of this kind of transition from wow to how. As we kind of start doing this, and getting to kind of implementation, who are the types of stakeholders that we should be considering when we start kind of developing this infrastructure and kind of implementing kind of this broader ecosystem of advanced air mobility?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. And I think, George, you touched it a little bit with the policy perspective and the political side. And I think usually from what we're seeing across the board in the US and globally, there is 4 categories that we can put most of those stakeholders that you need to have in if you want to make the soup of implementation of AAM. The main one, let's say the first one is the client, the end client perspective, the one that the user, the passenger, or the logistic company that will want to move goods from point A to point B, that really you use the technology to solve his problem. You use the technology to engage with the need as it goes from a community to a public agency, and a DOT could be a lot of cases. We see a entity as a client that had a lot of hats in that structure. The second one that we usually see is the local enablers. The local enablers that go from the local municipalities to the MPOs, as I mentioned before, to the planning entities, and to state governance that need to add that push, if you think about the enable the obstacles in the way, and there is a lot with the new emerging technology to implement, to structure a healthy roadmap into the ecosystem. And then you go into a more kind of US-wide enablers that create that healthy ecosystem around the solutioning across the board, from consultancies to CAMI to other kind of agencies in the FAA side that needs a lot of enablement assistance in most cases. And the fourth one, and I think a critical one, is the actual operators. The boots on the ground infrastructure operator that needs to deliver and to help all those enablers and the champion, the client, go all the way. And some of each of those characters, usually you have an entity that champion the position, an entity that takes it all the way as part of the DNA to change the ecosystem, to incorporate in the next budget cycle some investment in actual infrastructure, vertiports into specific areas, start thinking about neighborhood by neighborhood kind of effort, and champion the subject. So if you think about those 4 pillars, in each of them you can see a champion that worked through the need of the client in local enablers, US-wide enablers, and the actual operators that need to rise to the challenge of the ecosystem, if it makes sense to you.
What about you, kind of, Yolanka, in terms of the types of stakeholders that you think kind of should be kind of engaged?
Sure. So I agree with what Yotam has just said, so I'm not going to repeat that. I will add that there's a 5th group of stakeholders, and that's the non-users that live in the communities where this form of transportation will roll out. And they may be people who live under flight routes, they may be people who live around vertiports, but they may never use the form of transportation themselves. Mm-hmm. And so we could go on for a long time about the various positive and negative impacts. But I think certainly what we have found, and some of the language that we've changed around this conversation, when I first got involved with electric aviation a dozen years ago and first started looking at the concept of CAMI with Anna Dietrich, my co-founder, 4 years ago, the big question within industry was recognizing that as technology moved forward, as paths to certification started to take shape, we had this big question of public acceptance. And part of the challenge is just, what do we mean by the public? What do we mean by a community? But certainly the idea was, will the general public accept this? We've changed that conversation. Acceptance is a bit of a one-way, has a one-way connotation. We accept that we pay taxes. And so we look at this as a community engagement question. And what we know is that local planning departments, local public agencies have, for the most part, good public engagement processes for all kinds of things. So really what we need to do here is work at the local agency and planning level, trying to roll out an education campaign to the person on the street without having first engaged those local planners really doesn't set us up for success. So I'm going to say that there's that amorphous fifth stakeholder group, but I don't want that to imply that we need to roll out a broad public campaign now. We need to understand better what might work for any one community before we begin that engagement.
Thanks. So I'm curious from kind of, the OEM perspectives, Joby and Supernal, have you kind of started to kind of engage, I guess, not only stakeholders, but also the public, and what strategies have you found kind of most successful kind of on the engagement side?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I think I'll say a couple of things. I think people like being able to look, touch, and feel. So I think bringing people demonstrable opportunities has been really, really effective. And some of that is the aircraft itself, but I think it's also the passenger experience. What can they expect from that experience? We had a lot of success, about 35,000 people who came to Coventry, and I think again, we talk about public acceptance, and to me it's a lot. There's a business imperative of consumer cultivation, right? And again, a lot of people haven't flown in small aircraft, so I think bringing aviation to them as a household name is important. I would say the other thing that's sort of, I don't want to say an easy lift, but something that can be fairly easily done is putting AAM in the context of the human point of view. So some of those images that I brought up earlier in my intro, one of the that we got when we were engaging with folks in a couple of different cities is that there was too much what they would call investor-centric sort of imagery, right? They didn't see people in those images. They didn't see it as placemaking. It's things flying over people who are sadly in traffic, right? And so I think one sort of easy tool has been to work with communities to say, okay, well, if you take this vacant lot and you wanted to activate it and you wanted to put AAM in it, what would you use it for, right? So let's really survey and figure that out and engage with them. To Yotam's point, right? How do you think about your user and what they actually need and how you're going to fulfill it? And really work with them to then design that imagery that helps them think of themselves as part of that AAM ecosystem. Because I think sometimes, there's a tendency to focus on the fun hardware and stuff like that, and forget that you really have to make sure it connects to people. And so I think a lot of that is about the story that we tell, and what are those bespoke engagement tools that we can utilize to bring it again, aviation as a household name.
How about you, George?
So I think what's interesting is I like to take a step back, and while we are talking about AAM and transportation, what has been successful for us is when and yes, we've started all of these community engagements, and I love to say having 6 speakers at this conference is one example of our continued thorough engagement in our community, since we are literally right down the street. So cannot thank the DART and the community enough in Santa Cruz and in Northern California as well on this. But honestly, broadly, for us, it's we need to step back and say, why are we having this conversation? We are at a sort of historic moment in aviation. You had the creation of aviation, you had the jet age, and now you're having the electrification of aviation. So this is beyond just, oh, we have a cool new scooters we're gonna drop in neighborhoods so people can go around a couple feet, right? This is taking the hardest sector that is to decarbonize and beginning to electrify it, beginning to take those incremental steps, the same way we've talked about electric vehicles, and where now at 2035, the state of California will no longer sell you a combustion engine car vehicle. That took some effort, right? And so the beginning of that was electrification of the vehicle. And so we're in that similar pathway where we can do the revolution that we did with vehicles with aviation. AAM is one step of that, right? It is one element of that, but I think we're part of leading that broader conversation is how do we make aviation more sustainable and more accessible, right? Most people still are not part of the travel experience. Most people are still not daily on aircraft like we have the advantage of being, right? So I think talking about sustainability and what that is bringing to the communities is really the discussion we like to lead with. And that covers noise, that covers emission, that covers congestion, that covers pollution. And those are the equity elements we like to lean in on, because, you know, one of our dreams could be you do actually want to live near an airport, because you may, as to Yolanka's point, right now, living near an airport doesn't mean you're actually using that airport. But if you get to live near a vertiport, you may actually want to live near a vertiport, just like you may want to live near a metro stop. So I think stepping back and looking at the broader picture is what's been invaluable for us. And I think doing all of these local engagements, there's no, I don't think there's a secret bullet. I think it's incredible what Yolanka does with all the different groups that we're reaching out across the country. And to Yotam's point, like, it's local, but you also need that US energy and engagement, bringing it in locally as well. So I think all of those simultaneously are our trajectory.
That's a great point. Now, if you haven't done so already, you know, I encourage you to go to slido.com, #MBDART22, and put in some questions. We had a really good question here from somebody in the audience. After entry into service, challenges are solved, such as regulatory, community acceptance, and others. What do you see as the largest barrier to scaling air taxi operations?
Okay, I will take it. So that's a great question. We're trying to think, okay, we have a huge wall in front of us, and the question here is trying to say, okay, what happened after this wall? Maybe there is another wall. And I think some of it is go back to those, let's say, acceptance points that Yolanka mentioned here and George had mentioned in the environmental questions and challenges, is after you have a functionable solution that start working. Usually, as we see with New York City, for example, there is a lot of complaints, weekly, thousands of complaints, for example, on blade operation currently. And you can see that in other areas that there is a huge restrictions around helicopters transit. So you can go back and see why those transitions happen, because of the lack of community acceptance and involvement, even not acceptance, even involvement in the process of the decision making, environmental pollution, in noise acceptance, noise pollution to specific communities. And as George mentioned here, you want to live next to eVTOL or a vertiport, prospectively, from a commute, but you want to also live in a way that is still not changing dramatically your experience of your neighborhood and your city and your social life. And sometimes when we're trying to push scooters into the middle of the city, people don't like it. So I think that the next wall could be the point of Yolanka and George in the end of the day, how we make sure that this solution, after he works and after it works and incorporate into a complete trip, that you take your car and you switch to eVTOL and you go into the airport, how it still make you happy using it in most time of the day. Even if you're not using it, even if you look at the sky, and all those elements are, I think, could be critical as we go and see more and more of those operations come to life. Hopefully, we will see them come to life. I hope that answered the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just add that I think it's important to ask the question about what level of scalability is success, and not make an assumption that every system has to scale to a certain level. I think that, you know, I like to say that, you know, X number of years ago, when we all ended up first with mobile phones, none of us knew we needed them. And when we got them, we thought, cool new way to make a phone call. And now Adam's sitting up here with his notes for his questions here, and making phone calls is almost the last thing we do with them. I think there's tremendous opportunity to explore new ways to use this new technology that we may not have figured out yet. But just assuming that, you know, at 5 years ago when we first started seeing press about this, we saw images of vertiports designed to handle thousands of vehicles every hour. To assume that all of this is going to scale to that size, I think is a mistake. So I think the question comes with, what does successful scalability look like?
Terrific. Adrienne, George, do you have any thoughts in terms of kind of biggest kind of challenges towards scalability?
I'm going to take it from a 30,000 foot view, as they say, and to me, there's a couple. I think all those were very good points. I'll go back to airspace management in a environment where we have a lot more aircraft, and what is that going to look like? And when you start getting very particular about that, and that's both a technology question and a practical question. And then I'll say energy, and I don't think it's confined to advanced air mobility. I think, you know, George made some really great points about sustainability. One of the challenges, however, with a lot of transportation verticals all moving towards a zero emissions future simultaneously is that there's incredible stress on, and we've seen it play out, right, especially in North America on the energy grid. And I think we need to get really creative about how we're going to mix different energy sources to power the future. And I think that's particularly true for heavy duty applications like aviation, trucking, et cetera.
Thanks, Adrienne.
Plus one on that.
Yeah, George, what were you going to say?
No, just a plus one on the electric piece. But I also think what's going to be interesting is once these scale up, there's 10, 20 companies focused on a very specific product, either cargo, either autonomous, either rideshare. What's going to be interesting is once these get in the market, what if we end up using these to fight fires? What if we end up using these to monitor a crisis, or you know, how do we use these to move in emergency situations? The use cases we have not thought of, I think, are going to be very interesting challenges for us to face. And what if they're transporting organs and donors, et cetera? How do you do that in a safe manner? How do you integrate, you know, the unique, I look for those unique challenges that'll come up.
Terrific. So I've got one final question. We're gonna kind of do this as kind of a lightning round since we got a couple minutes left here. What is the most important thing that you think policymakers should focus on over the next 3 years? If you had to pick one or two things, what would be the most important? And we'll start in person here, and then we'll kind of go to kind of Adrienne and George.
Go ahead.
Okay, as you wish. So that's a great question, because those 3 years, and I think if you think about the 10 years, 3 years, there is a lot of forecasting based on regulation and again, cycles and capital and usage and adoption and technology. There is so many things that you need to touch. And I think it goes back to, I think Adrienne said it amazingly, and George, the UTM, the ATC part, the air traffic control, and the utilities are critical as part of those elements of planning for the next 3 years, so you will enable the 10 years after. You need in those 3 years to start thinking moving from the wow to the how, as I mentioned before, to think, okay, how I incorporate a new level of low altitude ATC to enable massive usage in five to 10 years, how the utilities will support the vertiport, and how do you engage in the things that critical to plan now that will happen only 10 years from now. So the strategic thinking is critical now to enable an actual operations into the multimodal transportation future. So I hope that's quick enough, Adam. My main point is really think hard in the next 3 years, because we're waiting for those regulation technologies and the barriers to be solved. While we're waiting, we have enough research from Raja and others that do an amazing job to give decision-making and planning processes and personnel the tools to start thinking as strategic on those solutions.
And I'm going to follow on to what Yotam said, but focus on the multimodal integration piece of that, and say I think that in the next few years, Policymakers need to really look at how to integrate this mode into a multimodal system. How do we look at this from a complete trip perspective? And how can we start planning transportation systems of the future that incorporate this mode so that we do the planning, we do the budgeting from that perspective, all of which will take more than 3 years. But I agree, the planning and budgeting need to start now. So we need to look at it from a multimodal integration perspective.
Adrienne?
I'm going to go with increasing capacity at core agencies that will be looked to for implementation. So whether that's your city planning department that doesn't have a line item funding to work on this, or the FAA, which probably could use a legislative authorization for additional funding given the amount of activity going on in aviation. Yeah, I think increasing capacity and figuring out what does that model look like.
Okay. George, how
or
about you?
dare I say CEQA? Just
okay.
saying. I'm just
So,
kidding.
so institutional readiness. George, how about you?
I agree with everything that was said, especially on the helping cities support and get the funding. I will add one thing to the wow to how, maybe it's wow to now to how, because I think I want to just be very optimistic and maybe close up on a positive note. This is happening, right? And you're going to have hundreds of folks go literally down the street to Marina and see an aircraft fly. It happens every day. It is revolutionary, but it's not. It's every day. There's a couple engineers out there. There's an aircraft that's flying. It's being tested remotely. We've got flight test pilots. You got aircraft pilots being trained, Air Force pilots being trained on it. So it's happening. And I think that's what's kind of jarring or takes people back, where it's like, what do you need? We just need the space at its core today, day one. But yes, then we need to tackle all the other aspects. But I think getting policymakers and residents and community to know, like, this is here, it is now, and let's get to the how we get bigger. So I'm going to steal that from you and use that for the future, by the way. So wow now to how.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank, all of our panelists for joining us today.